The building exploded in a shower of concrete and flame just 20 yards to my left, and I felt the Sherman tank buck beneath me like a wild horse as shrapnel hammered against our steel hull. Through the driver's vision port, I could see a Filipino woman clutching her child, both of them screaming as they ran down the narrow alley between the burning remains of what had once been beautiful Spanish colonial homes. The acrid smoke of cordite and burning flesh filled my nostrils, and somewhere in the chaos, a Japanese sniper's bullet pinged off our turret with a metallic shriek that cut through the roar of our engine and the distant crack of rifle fire. This was Manila in February 1945, and IWA's driving straight into hell. My name is Staff Sergeant Tommy Kowalski, and I was the driver of a Sherman M4A3E8 tank called Chicago Fire in the 44th Tank Battalion, 6th Army. What I'm about to tell you is the story of how we liberated the Pearl of the Orient and why that victory came at a price that still haunts my dreams 78 years later. It was February 3, 1945, when General MacArthur's forces first entered Manila. I remember that date because it was supposed to be the beginning of the end, the moment when we would finally drive the Japanese out of the Philippines and restore freedom to the Filipino people who had suffered under 3 years of brutal occupation. What we found instead was a city turned into a fortress and an enemy determined to destroy everything beautiful and sacred rather than let it fall into American hands. The Japanese had been preparing for this moment since the beginning of 1945. Under the command of Rear Admiral Sanji Iwabuchi, approximately 17,000 Japanese naval troops had turned Manila into a death trap. They had no intention of simply defending the city. They planned to demolish it, block by block, building by building, taking as many Americans and Filipinos with them as possible. I was 22 years old, a farm boy from Iowa who had never seen a city larger than Des Moines before the war. Nothing in my training had prepared me for what awaited us in those narrow streets where Spanish colonial architecture became a maze of death, where every window might hide a sniper, where every doorway could conceal a suicide bomber with a satchel charge. Our tank crew consisted of 5 men squeezed into 32 tons of steel and fury. There was Lieutenant Jim Morrison, our tank commander from Boston, cool under fire and sharp as a tack. Sergeant Bill Rodriguez from Los Angeles served as our gunner, and he could put a 75mm shell through a window at 300 yards. Corporal Mike O'Brien from Chicago handled the machine gun, and Private Danny Walsh from Alabama was our loader, the youngest of us at barely 19. We had been fighting our way through Luzon for weeks, but nothing had prepared us for Manila. The Japanese had constructed intricate defensive positions throughout the city, turning churches, schools, and government buildings into fortresses. They had laid mines in the streets, rigged buildings with explosives, and positioned artillery pieces in locations where they could rake our advancing columns with devastating fire. The morning of February 5th, we received orders to advance through the Ermita district toward the old walled city of Intramuros. Intelligence told us that Japanese resistance was moderate to light. Intelligence, as we would soon learn, was dead wrong. "Driver, advance." Lieutenant Morrison's voice crackled through the intercom as we rolled down what had once been a tree-lined boulevard. The trees were gone now, reduced to charred stumps by artillery fire. The pavement was pocked with shell holes, and the remains of abandoned vehicles littered the street like the bones of some massive graveyard. I shifted into first gear and felt the Sherman's engine roar to life. The familiar vibration traveled up through the driver's seat, through my bones, and into my very soul. In combat, you become one with your machine. Every sound, every vibration, every subtle change in performance could mean the difference between life and death. As we rounded the corner onto Taft Avenue, the first thing I noticed was the silence. Manila had been a city of over 1 million people before the war, but now it felt like a ghost town. The Japanese had forced most of the civilian population into concentration areas, but thousands had fled into the countryside or were hiding in whatever shelter they could find. "Movement, 2 o'clock. O'Brien called out, his voice tense. Through my vision port, I could see them, a group of Filipino civilians running across the street, carrying bundles and suitcases, their faces etched with terror. An elderly man stumbled and fell, and a young woman stopped to help him up. They were maybe 100 yards away, running toward what they hoped was safety. That's when the Japanese opened up. Machine gun fire erupted from the second story of a concrete building, the muzzle flashes like deadly fire fleece in the shadowy windows. The bullets kicked up dust in the street, and I watched in horror as several of the fleeing civilians were cut down. The elderly man I had seen fall was hit multiple times, his body jerking like a marionette with its strings cut. Target building, second floor. Morrison barked. Identified. Rodriguez replied, his voice calm and professional despite the chaos around us. The Sherman's turret traversed left with a mechanical whine, and I could feel the 75mm gun moving above my head. Through the intercom, I heard Rodriguez announce, on the way. The tank bucketed as the main gun fired, and the building erupted in a shower of concrete and dust. The machine gun fire stopped immediately, but I knew there would be more. There was always more. Driver, advance to the next intersection, Morrison ordered. I pressed the accelerator, and we lurched forward. The Sherman's tracks bit into the rubble-strewn pavement, and I navigated around an overturned bus that had been converted into a roadblock. The smell of cordite and burning gasoline filled the fighting compartment, mixed with the acrid smoke that seemed to hang over the entire city like a funeral shroud. As we approached the intersection, I could see the spires of several churches in the distance, their bells silent now. Some of the most beautiful architecture in the Far East was in Manila, built during centuries of Spanish colonial rule. The Japanese were systematically destroying it all. Halt! Morrison commanded, and I brought the tank to a stop. Through the periscope, I could see the intersection ahead. It was a perfect killing zone, a wide-open space where Japanese gunners positioned in the surrounding buildings would have clear fields of fire. The remains of several American vehicles were scattered across the intersection, testimony to previous attempts to break through. We're going to have to make a run for it, Morrison said quietly. Rodriguez, I want you to lay down suppressing fire on those buildings to the right. O'Brien, keep that. 30 cal ready. Walsh, make sure we've got rounds loaded. Roger that, Lieutenant, came the replies. This was the moment when time seemed to slow down, when every sense became heightened, when the boundary between life and death became as thin as a razor's edge. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears, could feel the sweat running down my back despite the cool February air. Driver, advance. I floored the accelerator, and the Sherman shot forward like a racehorse out of the gate. The 32 tons of steel and armor picked up speed as we rushed toward the intersection, and I could see the muzzle flashes erupting from windows and doorways on both sides of the street. The first anti-tank round missed us by inches, slamming into the pavement just to our right and sending up a shower of concrete fragments. The second round hit our front slope armor with a tremendous clang, but the thick steel held. The ricochet screamed off into the distance like a banshee's wail. Take that building, Morrison shouted, and Rodriguez traversed the turret toward a 3-story structure where I could see the distinctive muzzle blast of a Japanese anti-tank gun. The Sherman's main gun fired, and the building's facade disintegrated in a cloud of dust and debris. But there were more buildings, more guns, more desperate Japanese soldiers who had been ordered to fight to the death. A satchel charge exploded against our left track, and I felt the tank shudder. For a terrifying moment, I thought we had thrown a track, which would have left us sitting ducks in the middle of the intersection. But the Sherman kept moving, and I realized we had taken only minor damage. Keep going, Morrison yelled, and I pressed the accelerator to the floor. We burst through the intersection in a storm of flying steel and explosive fury, the Sherman's engine roaring like a caged beast. Behind us, the intersection disappeared in a cloud of smoke and dust, but we were through. We had made it. But the hardest fighting was still ahead. As we advanced deeper into the city, the destruction became more apparent. Entire blocks had been reduced to rubble, and the few buildings that remained standing were pockmarked with bullet holes and shrapnel scars. The Japanese had been true to their word. They were destroying Manila with systematic thoroughness. O'Brien whispered over the intercom, "Look at that." Through my vision port, I could see what had once been a beautiful Catholic church. The Japanese had rigged it with explosives, and the entire structure had collapsed into a pile of rubble. Bodies were scattered around the ruins, civilians who had been seeking shelter in what they had believed was a sanctuary. This was the horror of the Battle of Manila. The Japanese had made the decision to turn the city into a fortress, and when they realized they could not hold it, they began a systematic campaign of destruction that would claim the lives of over 100,000 Filipino civilians. They murdered entire families, burned hospitals, and demolished schools. They showed no mercy to the very people they had claimed to be liberating from Western imperialism. Our column continued its advance through the Ermita district, and with each block we conquered, the evidence of Japanese atrocities became more apparent. We found mass graves where hundreds of civilians had been executed. We discovered hospitals where patients had been burned alive in their beds. We liberated schools where children had been bayoneted by Japanese soldiers who had gone insane with bloodlust. But we also found Filipino resistance fighters who had been fighting the Japanese for 3 years, armed with nothing but captured weapons and an unbreakable spirit. They guided us through themes of streets, warned us of Japanese strong points, and showed us where civilians might be hiding. One of these fighters was a young woman named Maria Santos, who couldn't have been more than 20 years old. She had been working with American intelligence since 1942, and she knew the city better than any of us. When she climbed onto the back of our tank on the morning of February 7th, I thought she was just another refugee. "I was wrong, Sergeant," she said to Morrison in perfect English. "The Japanese have a strong point 3 blocks ahead. They have an anti-tank gun positioned in the old post office building, and they're using civilians as human shields." Morrison studied his map. "Can we go around?" "No," Maria replied. "They have the entire area covered. But there's a way to get close without being seen. I can show you." What followed was one of the most harrowing experiences of my life. Maria guided us through a series of narrow alleys that barely accommodated the Sherman's width. We had to drive with our engine at idle to avoid making noise, and more than once I had to back up and try a different route when we encountered obstacles. The Japanese were everywhere. I could hear them talking in the buildings above us, could smell their cooking fires, could sometimes see their shadows moving past windows. If they had discovered us in those narrow alleys, we would have been trapped like rats in a maze. After what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes, we reached a position where Rodriguez could engage the anti-tank gun. But first, we had to deal with the civilians. Through the periscope, I could see them, dozens of Filipino families herded into the ground floor of the post office building. The Japanese had positioned their gun on the second floor, directly above the civilians. It was a diabolical strategy that put us in an impossible position. "We can't fire on that building," Morrison said quietly. "Too many innocents." "Then we'll have to go in and get them," Rodriguez replied. This was the moment that defined everything about the Battle of Manila. The Japanese had turned the city into a fortress, but they had also turned it into a prison for the Filipino people. Every tactical decision we made had to account for the civilians who were caught in the crossfire. Morrison made the decision to dismount and assault the building on foot, leaving me and Walsh with the tank while he, Rodriguez, and O'Brien went in with their carbines and Thompson submachine guns. Maria Santos went with them, armed with a captured Japanese rifle that she handled with deadly efficiency. I watched through the periscope as they approached the building. The Japanese had placed snipers in the upper floors, and I could see muzzle flashes erupting from the windows. Morrison's team took cover behind a low wall, and I could hear the sharp crack of rifle fire echoing through the narrow streets. The firefight lasted for maybe 10 minutes, but it felt like hours. I could hear the chatter of O'Brien's Thompson, the deeper bark of Rodriguez's carbine, and the distinctive crack of Maria's rifle. There were screams from inside the building, some Japanese, some Filipino, all human. Then there was silence. "Kowalski, bring the tank up to the building." Morrison's voice crackled through the radio. "We've got civilians coming out, and I need you to cover the street." I shifted into first gear and drove the Sherman forward. As I approached the building, I could see Filipino families streaming out of the ground floor. Men, women, children, all of them clearly terrified but alive. Maria Santos was helping an elderly woman down the steps, and I could see that the young Filipino fighter had been wounded in the shoulder. "The gun's out of action," Morrison reported, "but there are more Japanese positions ahead. This is just the beginning." He was right. The Battle of Manila would continue for another 3 weeks, and every day would bring new horrors, new challenges, new tests of our resolve and our humanity. The Japanese had approximately 17,000 troops in the city, and they were determined to make us pay for every building, every street, every block. As we continued our advance through the city, the nature of the fighting changed. This wasn't the open warfare we had trained for, where tanks could maneuver and infantry could advance across open ground. This was urban warfare at its most brutal, room to room, building to building, where the enemy could be hiding behind any door or window. The Sherman tank, for all its power and protection, wasn't designed for this kind of fighting. In the narrow streets of Manila, we were vulnerable to satchel charges, anti-tank rifles, and suicide bombers who would run at us with explosive charges strapped to their bodies. We had to modify our tactics, working closely with infantry and using the tank's armor to protect advancing troops rather than leading breakthrough attacks. Over the next several days, we fought our way through the University District, where the Japanese had turned the classrooms into bunkers and the dormitories into ammunition storage areas. We liberated the old Manila Hotel, where General MacArthur had once lived, and found it had been booby-trapped with enough explosives to level an entire city block. But the most difficult fighting was yet to come. On February 17th, we received orders to assault Intramuros, the old walled city that had been the center of Spanish colonial power for over 3 centuries. The Japanese had turned it into their final stronghold, and they were prepared to defend it to the last man. Intramuros was surrounded by massive stone walls that had been built in the 16th century. The Japanese had reinforced these walls with concrete and steel, and they had positioned artillery pieces and anti-tank guns to cover every approach. Intelligence estimated that over 4,000 Japanese troops were defending the walled city, along with hundreds of Filipino civilians who were being held as human shields. The assault began at dawn on February 17th with a massive artillery barrage. For 2 hours, American 155mm howitzers pounded the walls of Intramuros, and the sound was like the end of the world. I could feel the concussion of the shells through the ground, and the air itself seemed to vibrate with the force of the explosions. When the barrage lifted, we moved forward. The Sherman's engine roared to life, and we joined a column of tanks and infantry that advanced across the open ground toward the breached walls. The Japanese had prepared for this moment, and they met us with everything they had. Anti-tank rounds screamed past our turret, and machine gun fire swept the street like a deadly rain. I could see other Shermans in our column taking hits, some of them brewing up in spectacular explosions that sent turrets flying through the air like toys. The infantry was taking heavy casualties, and I could hear the anguished cries of wounded men over the radio. But we kept moving forward. This was what we had trained for, what we had come halfway around the world to do. We were going to liberate Manila, no matter what the cost. The first breach in the wall was maybe 20 feet wide, filled with rubble and debris from the artillery barrage. I could see Japanese soldiers moving in the shadows beyond the breach, and I knew they were waiting for us to come through. "Driver, take us through the breach," Morrison commanded. I downshifted and felt the Sherman's tracks bite into the rubble. The tank climbed up and over the debris, and for a moment we were silhouetted against the sky, perfect targets for every Japanese gunner in Intramuros. A satchel charge exploded against our right track, and the tank lurched violently to the side. I fought to keep us moving, but I could feel that we had thrown the track. We were immobilized in the most dangerous position possible, stuck in the breach where the Japanese could concentrate their fire. "Bail out," Morrison shouted. "Abandon the tank." But as I reached for the hatch release, I saw them. A group of Filipino children, maybe 6 or 7 years old, were huddled against the wall just inside the breach. They were directly in the line of fire, and if we abandoned the tank now, they would be killed in the crossfire. "Lieutenant," I called out, "there are kids down there." Morrison looked through his periscope and saw what I had seen. For a moment, he was silent. Then, his voice calm and determined, he said, "We're not leaving. Rodriguez, can you get the main gun on that building?" "Roger that," Rodriguez replied. What followed was the longest 5 minutes of my life. Immobilized in the breach, we became a stationary target for every Japanese position in Intramuros. Anti-tank rounds hammered our armor, and I could hear the distinctive whine of ricochet as bullets bounced off our steel hull. But Rodriguez and O'Brien fought back with everything we had. The 75mm gun fired round after round into the Japanese positions, and O'Brien's machine guns swept the areas where enemy troops were trying to advance. The noise inside the tank was deafening, and the air was thick with cordite smoke. Outside, I could see American infantry advancing through the breach, using our immobilized tank as cover. They moved in short rushes, diving for cover behind rubble and debris, returning fire with their rifles and submachine guns. And through it all, those Filipino children stayed huddled against the wall, too terrified to move. I wanted to dismount and carry them to safety, but Morrison wouldn't let me leave the tank. "Stay at your position," he ordered. "Wear their shield right now." Finally, after what felt like hours, the firing began to slacken. American troops had established a foothold inside Intramuros, and the Japanese were being forced to fall back to secondary positions. The immediate threat to the children was over. "Kowalski, O'Brien, get out there and see if you can repair that track," Morrison ordered. I climbed out of the driver's hatch and dropped to the ground. The air outside was thick with smoke and dust, and I could hear the sound of fighting from deeper within the walled city. The track repair was going to take time, and we were still in a dangerous position. As O'Brien and I worked on the track, I could see the children more clearly. They were emaciated, their clothes torn and dirty, their eyes wide with terror. But they were alive, and that was what mattered. One of them, a little girl who couldn't have been more than 6 years old, approached the tank cautiously. She was carrying a small doll made from scraps of cloth, and she looked up at me with eyes that had seen too much. "Americano?" she whispered. I nodded and smiled, trying to look as non-threatening as possible. "Yeah, sweetheart." "American," she smiled back, and for a moment, the war seemed to recede. This was why we were here. This was why we had come so far from home, why we had risked everything. Not for glory or conquest, but for moments like this, for the chance to give freedom back to people who had been living under the boot of tyranny. The track repair took about an hour, and during that time, more American troops moved through the breach. The 129th Infantry Regiment had taken the lead in the assault on Intramuros, and they were advancing building by building, room by room, rooting out the Japanese defenders. When we finally got the Sherman mobile again, we joined the advance into the heart of the walled city. What we found there defied description. The Japanese had systematically destroyed everything of value: churches, schools, government buildings, anything that represented Filipino culture or Spanish colonial heritage. But they had also murdered civilians with systematic brutality. We found mass graves, burned hospitals, and evidence of atrocities that would have been unimaginable before the war. The Japanese had shown no mercy to the Filipino people, and they expected none from us. The fighting continued for another week. The Japanese defended every building, every room, every hallway with fanatic determination. They used mines, booby traps, and suicide attacks to slow our advance, but nothing could stop the inevitable. On February 23rd, we finally reached the center of Intramuros. The Japanese had made their final stand in the old Spanish cathedral, and it took a direct hit from our 75mm gun to dislodge them. When the smoke cleared, the cathedral was in ruins, and the last organized resistance in Manila was over. But the cost had been enormous. The Sixth Army had lost over 1,000 men killed and 5,500 wounded during the month-long battle. The Japanese had lost virtually their entire garrison, approximately 16,000 men, killed with only a handful taken prisoner. But the greatest tragedy was the civilian casualties. Over 100,000 Filipino civilians had been killed, most of them murdered by the Japanese in their final orgy of destruction. Manila, the pearl of the Orient, had been liberated. But the beautiful city that had once been the jewel of the Far East lay in ruins. 70% of the buildings had been destroyed, and the civilian population had been decimated. It would take decades to rebuild what had been destroyed in just 1 month of fighting. As we drove through the ruins of the city in the days after the battle, I couldn't help but think about the cost of victory. Yes, we had driven the Japanese out of the Philippines. Yes, we had restored freedom to the Filipino people. But at what price? The little girl with the doll had survived, along with her family. I saw her again during the victory parade, and she ran up to the tank and gave me a small flower that she had picked from the ruins of her neighborhood. She was smiling, and in her smile, I could see the hope of a nation that had endured 3 years of brutal occupation and emerged, battered but not broken, into the light of freedom. The Battle of Manila was over, but the war continued. We would go on to fight in other battles, on other islands, until the Japanese finally surrendered in August 1945. But for me, the war would always be defined by those weeks in Manila, when we learned that liberation sometimes requires destruction, and that victory always comes at a price. The Sherman tank Chicago Fire survived the battle, though it bore the scars of dozens of hits from anti-tank rounds and shrapnel. The crew survived as well, though we were all changed by what we had seen and done. Lieutenant Morrison was awarded the Silver Star for his leadership during the assault on Intramuros. Rodriguez and O'Brien both received Bronze Stars for their courage under fire. Danny Walsh, our young loader, was promoted to corporal and went on to serve in the occupation of Japan. As for me, I returned to Iowa after the war, married my high school sweetheart, and raised a family on the same farm where I had grown up. But I never forgot Manila, never forgot the smell of cordite and burning buildings, never forgot the sound of civilians screaming in languages I didn't understand. The Philippines had been liberated, but the price of that liberation would echo through history. The Battle of Manila stands as one of the most destructive urban battles of World War II, a reminder that even in victory, war leaves scars that never fully heal. But it also stands as a testament to the courage of ordinary men and women who faced extraordinary circumstances and chose to do what was right, regardless of the cost. The American soldiers who fought in Manila, the Filipino resistance fighters who guided us through the maze of streets, and the civilians who endured 3 years of occupation with unbreakable spirit, all of them contributed to a victory that restored freedom to a nation that had never stopped believing in the promise of liberty. Today, Manila is a thriving metropolis once again, home to millions of people who live in freedom because of what happened in those terrible weeks of February 1945. The scars of war have been healed by time and the indomitable spirit of the Filipino people, but the memory of those who gave their lives for freedom remains. In the end, that's what the Battle of Manila was about, not conquest or glory, but the simple human desire to be free. And that's a cause worth fighting for, no matter what the cost. The Sherman tank Chicago fire now sits in a museum in Iowa, a silent witness to one of the most important battles of World War II. Sometimes, when I visit it, I can still hear the roar of the engine, still feel the vibration of the tracks on cobblestone streets, still smell the smoke of a city burning in the name of freedom. And sometimes, if I close my eyes, I can still see that little girl with the doll, smiling in the ruins of her city, holding a flower that somehow managed to grow in the midst of all that destruction. That smile, that flower, that moment of hope in the darkness, that's what we were fighting for. That's what made it all worthwhile.